Maybe your body isn't transforming the way you expected. Maybe you just finished a bulk and you're terrified of losing all that hard-earned muscle. Maybe you're over 40 and wondering if building muscle is even possible anymore. Or maybe you're so burned out from dieting that the thought of another cut makes you want to give up. Today, I'm teaming up with Brandon DaCruz to answer 5 body composition questions that keep you up at night. The ones that determine whether you'll actually achieve the physique you want or stay stuck for years. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that helps you build a strong, healthy physique using evidence, engineering, and efficiency. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today I'm very excited, guys. I'm bringing you something fun here, a collaboration with none other than Brandon DaCruz, accredited nutritionist, world-class online physique coach, and co-host of the Chasing Clarity podcast. Now, Brandon is joining me for the 3rd time here on Wits and Weights to help me answer your most pressing questions about body composition, building muscle, training, and more, based as always on the evidence and our firsthand in the trenches experience coaching many clients. If you want to hear the other side of this conversation where I join Brandon to tackle even more questions related to managing hunger during fat loss, beating cravings, and other topics related to that, head over to the Chasing Clarity podcast, find it in your podcast app, or click the link in the show notes, give it a follow. You're going to find that episode in your feed right now. We drop them on the same day. Again, the link is in the show notes. Go look for Chasing Clarity podcast. And Brandon, my man, thank you again for reaching out to make this happen and for coming on the show again.
Absolutely, my friend. It's a pleasure, and I'm really happy with how our last episode just went, since we're recording back to back, and I'm really looking forward to digging into this and really giving a lot of evidence-based and also practically applicable information for your audience.
As you always do. And the 2 episodes have quite different topics. So guys, definitely when you're done with this, next in your feed, go right over to Chasing Clarity. And we're going to get right into it with our first question today. This is a good one. What is the best post-bulk strategy to preserve muscle and lose fat for women over 40, especially during perimenopause?
All right. So this is a situation I deal with quite often because I work with a lot of women over 40 that are going through hormonal transitions like perimenopause. Now, there are a few key strategies I use when transitioning a client from a building phase into a fat loss phase, especially if the goal is to preserve muscle, drop body fat, and do it in a way that supports their long-term health and sustainability. So the first thing I want to look at is the rate of loss, because that is something that we're going to have to determine right off the bat. And how I really approach this is I use what I call a descending and dynamic rate of loss. So when I kick off a fat loss phase, I actually start with a slightly quicker rate of loss up front, and then gradually I slow it down as we move throughout the phase. So instead of tiptoeing into a deficit, which is something that some people make the mistake of doing, and they're not really getting progress off the bat, what I'll do is I'll create a more assertive calorie deficit at the start, which allows us to leverage the motivation they have, the fact that they have very little, if any, diet fatigue, and they've been in a surplus for an extended period of time. So there's more calories to pull from. And then also I want to utilize the fact that body fat is at its highest, meaning that there's more stored energy that we can pull from, and there's less risk of muscle loss. And within that, what I found is when I take a quicker rate of loss in the beginning, lets us get some wins. And it's a psychological win for that person because those early body composition changes create momentum, and that momentum facilitates better adherence. So we're getting longer term or better outcomes in the long term. Then as we diet and fatigue, diet fatigue especially accumulates, I'll taper the deficit down to a more moderate approach. So usually what I'm doing, and I'm going to give you a broad-based perspective, but oftentimes it'll look like something like I might start at 1% body weight loss per week. And then I'm going to taper to 0.5. And then when I get, especially women, very lean, it's going to be like 0.25 per week towards the end of the phase. Now, the second key component is going to be resistance training. We cannot, overlook that. It's so important that if your goal is to preserve muscle, that you train in a way that sends a signal to maintain it. So I always tell clients that the training that built the muscle is the training that will maintain it. And this becomes even more critical for women over 40 who may be dealing with hormonal changes that make muscle retention more challenging. So we want to make sure we're sending the right signal to your body that muscle is needed. The next thing I'm going to do is I want someone to follow a high protein diet. And this is really going to help with enhancing your ability to maintain muscle. It's going to help with appetite regulation, and it improves insulin sensitivity, which is really important if we're looking specifically at women over 40 in that perimenopause transition, whether that be peri or even into the menopause transition. A lot of times the downregulation of hormones, especially the decline in estradiol, is going to contribute to impacting their body composition, their appetite regulation, and their metabolic health, especially from an insulin sensitivity perspective. This is a little bit different than most people would recommend, but one thing I found in practice to be be very advantageous is I always suggest having your labs done prior to jumping into a deficit because we want to look at how things are looking internally. And personally, I work with a lot of women from the ages of, say, 35 to 55, and many of them are high achievers. And that's great. I love that mentality. I love that type A personality. But what does that come with? For every gimme, there's a gotcha. So many of these women are burning the candle at both ends between their profession and then their personal lives. And they're often putting their health last. So what I like to do is have clients run blood work to assess sex hormones, thyroid function, and stress markers to make sure that things are in the right place. And I really want to make sure that estrogen and progesterone aren't bottomed out yet at this phase in life, that their thyroid function is sufficient to support fat loss. And I also want to make sure that cortisol isn't chronically elevated from whether that be stress, under recovery, or lifestyle factors. Because if you start a fat loss phase with dysregulated hormones and metabolic dysfunction, it's going to make the process harder. And a lot of women in this age group are already having trouble with that. So if you have put in the time, effort, and energy to do a bulk, to do a muscle gain phase, which I commend you for, because I love seeing women become the strongest version of themselves. You really want to put yourself in the position to succeed, making sure that everything is in check before you go into a fat loss phase, and then take approach that's going to be fit to your physiology and also to your psychology.
Yeah, I love everything you said, especially how we're coming from a strategy here from someone who is should be congratulated for doing something that very few people, let alone women, but men and women, will, I'll say, have the courage to even attempt and to go after really building, going into an improvement phase, adding weight, knowing that some fat might come along for the ride to optimize their ability to build muscle, which is one of the most critical things at this time of life because of what you talked about, the hormones. I also like the phrases you have for everything, descending and dynamic. I'm going to steal some of this because I do love the idea of going all out, pretty aggressive at first. We also have to understand as part of that, I wanted to piggyback off of that, the idea of lean mass versus muscle versus body fat, because there's fears that go both directions. The fear going up, of course, is I'm going to get too fat. I'm going to gain too much fat. The fear going down is I'm going to lose all my muscle. I'm going to get deflated. And it's helpful if you're tracking and measuring, circumference, and I don't want to say body fat directly, but you can infer body fat from trends reasonably accurately so that you understand, okay, there's sometimes that whoosh effect early on in a fat loss phase, which doesn't mean you've lost all your muscle, within 2 weeks. And I think that helps from the fear in this question, which is how do I preserve muscle? Obviously you hit on training being the biggest signal, protein being extremely important, but even understanding that you are not losing muscle even if the data shows a big drop in weight or quote unquote lean mass, because a lot of that's going to be fluid, so that you don't react, you don't overreact and say, okay, I need to get back out of this, and stop trying this. The diet itself too, I always like to think of how are you eating during your bulk? Were you maintaining the foundation of whole foods, or were you adding a lot of processed foods? Again, no judgment. Some people do that if they need to get the calories, but it can be more difficult when your diet has biased or skewed away from that when you go back into fat loss phase. And it takes a different mentality to reset to that point versus somebody just maybe starting fat loss for the first time, not having gone through the muscle building phase. So I think we hit on the big things with, again, training, protein, the rate of loss, the lean mass, and then the diet itself. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think we really recapped that well, my friend.
Cool. All right, let's go to the next one. Good luck on that fat loss phase. We're here for you. So the next one is about, this is a good one. This is good for Brandon because Brandon is the energy flux guy. All right. And I guess I'm answering it first, but you're going to have a lot to add to this. The question is there a point where increasing daily steps no longer boosts energy expenditure meaningfully? I get this a lot. You probably do. You probably get it a lot. Because it's interesting. You'll have somebody say, look, I get 20,000 steps a day. Should I go to 30? I'll get interesting questions like that. And I was wondering where I should attack this. One prong is talking about the constrained energy model, because I love the subtleties behind that. I know you've talked about it on your show a lot, and it's highly misunderstood. So we'll see if I don't misrepresent it. But for most people, an increase in movement is going to be somewhat correlated with an increase in expenditure up to a point. And then there's some sort of diminishing returns, and it's all tied into how the body compensates. But it's also very individual, right? It depends on what kind of responder you are to NEAT, whether when you increase your step count, you are compensating elsewhere, and so on. So I think, number one, I always think of, are you measuring and tracking the results of these changes pretty precisely? For me, for my clients, that is we're tracking food, we're tracking weight, so we have a good estimation of your expenditure. Let's change one variable. You talked about this earlier. I think it was on your show or this one. I don't know. Changing one variable at a time, right? Like an engineer, like a scientist. Go ahead and add that 5,000 steps a day and see what it does to your biofeedback, to your expenditure, to everything else. There is a sweet spot, though, is also part of my answer here, in that most people are going to benefit somewhere in that 8 to 12,000 range and maybe a little more. But once you get into the 20s, I suspect that now you're getting into slightly more excessive, extreme regimes of walking for a lot of people, but not necessarily everybody. And is it stressing you out? Is it affecting, your cortisol, your feeling of burnout? Are you doing it? Are you forcing yourself to do it because you feel like you have to burn more calories and there's other levers you could take advantage of? So I'm going to start there, Brandon, because energy flux is part of this, and I want to hear your take on it.
All right, so I'm going to disentangle this from energy flux because the high energy flux approach that I've taken is mostly done through dialing in and increasing energy expenditure through steps, but I'm also doing it with a concomitant increase in food. So if you ever hear me speak about this concept, it's always eat more, move more. It's never the reverse, nor is it are we chasing movement to get down calories. It's more so that I'm trying to get this intrinsic link between energy expenditure and energy intake and getting this coupling effect where I can get someone into a higher maintenance calorie intake. And there's many things, more nuanced approaches that I utilize and very context specific that often I don't get to get into with podcasts just because, I'm not able to do a lot of like case study reviews. But when I saw this question come through, I said, this is definitely targeted towards me because especially of a podcast I've gotten a lot of questions about that I did with Lyle McDonald's. And a few months back, we really broke down some of the misinterpretations of the constrained energy expenditure model. And that was a 3-hour podcast. So I won't be able to re-encompass it here, but I will give you my thoughts, both based on the literature, because I read 22 papers for that podcast, and then in conjunction with having worked with 1,100 plus people over the years, utilize step count as a way to increase energy expenditure, increase maintenance calories, be able to get people in who what I consider and what I refer to as a state of abundance in addition. So first off of that, I do want to make it clear because sometimes people get this misconstrued. I do believe that energy compensation exists. I do believe in the constrained energy expenditure model. But I think that the point where additional activity stops contributing to meaningful energy expenditure increases is actually a lot higher than most people think. And I think that a lot of people have taken that model where you do a comparative analysis and you look at the constrained model where it's a sloping off and it's also like an asymptote. And then you look at the additive model where it just linearly goes up. And many people say, oh, well, the constrained model means that, if I do extra cardio, I'm never going to burn, the calories that I thought I could. Well, there's many inaccuracies within that because of the fact that a lot of these activity trackers are very off in terms of their accuracy in estimating energy expenditure. So there was a meta-analysis on this that found that risk-worn and commercially available activity trackers are between 28 to 93% off, I believe. Now, when it comes to step counts, now this is very interesting because we have limited data from people that have consistently hit high step counts. So the one study that I can think of that actually looked at this was a study I often speak about, which is the Amish study. And this is essentially where researchers tracked physical activity in a traditional Amish community. And so what they found was that the Amish men in this culture consistently averaged 18.4 steps per day. And then the women averaged over 14,000 steps per day. But then when we look at their body composition, the men were walking around with 9.4% body fat with no dietary intervention. They ate, plentiful food. I think their calories were around 3,600 calories. And the women had 25% body fat. However, the average woman in that culture, specifically in that Amish community that they looked at, had 6 to 7 children. So the data is confounded by the fact that a lot of times when they're doing these measurements, some of these women are pregnant. So obviously they have higher adiposity levels, which is essential for carrying a baby to term. Now, even with very high step counts, between 14 and 18,000, we still see clear metabolic and body composition benefits. So it is safe to say that they are burning more calories. But to really answer this question, I think we need to discuss a concept that's often overlooked, which is referred to as maximum metabolic scope or maximum sustainable metabolic scope. And what that tells us is how far above your resting energy needs, your resting metabolic rate, can your body maintain energy output on a consistent basis? And the best data we have from that is actually an endurance training study. It's an overview, like an umbrella review by, I believe it's by Thurber and colleagues. And they looked at athletes ranging from extreme endurance athletes like triathlons to ultramarathons to even like the race across the USA, which is, I believe, a 20-week essentially contest or competition where you run a marathon a day, 6 days a week for 20 weeks. So we're talking about very extreme expenditure levels. Now, when we actually look in short bursts, elite athletes, especially endurance athletes, can burn between 9 to 10 times their BMR in events like Ironmans or even ultra marathons. But when it comes to your actual sustained energy expenditure, the maximum sustainable metabolic scope is found to be 2.5 to 3 times basal metabolic rate. So I'll give you guys an example to really break that down practically. I have a BMR that's around 2,000 calories. So that means my maximum sustainable energy expenditure would be 5,000 calories per day. Now, if you're someone out there that you're lighter than I am, I'm an over 200-pound male, I'm over 6 foot tall, so I'm a little bit bigger than the average individual. But say that you're the average woman walking around, your BMR is usually going to be closer, say, to 1,600 calories. So that means your maximum daily output is still 4,000 calories per day. But to actually reach that amount of energy expenditure, you need to be moving essentially all day. You need to train, walk, and be physically active probably 4 to 6 hours a day. I actually did some calculations for my podcast with Lyle, and it was really like higher level output in addition to training for 5 to 6 hours a day to get to these maximum sustainable outputs. Now, here's the thing. That's if you did it in a single day. You would have to do this consistently to actually see a constraint. And just realistically, I always think about this in a practical perspective. I work with people in the real world. They're busy. A lot of people are actually underactive more than they're overactive. And so the average person in the general population and most of our clients, they aren't anywhere near this ceiling. So yes, I do believe that there is a point of diminishing returns, but no, the vast majority of people won't hit it. And I don't believe that they have to worry about it.
Yeah, you hit it on the head right there. I was just thinking like, let's stop overthinking it. I'm sure you have the client that loves to send you multiple questions a day and overthink all this stuff, which is great. I love curiosity. But the question was, implying, should I keep going up because it's going to help my energy expenditure? And I like how you answered that. What's interesting is we can think more creatively when it comes to our movement and our time efficiency. My clients are all super busy. I'm busy, you're busy. And I always think, okay, what are you trying to do when you ask this question? If you're trying to boost your energy expenditure, can we just make your walking a little bit harder, right? Can we use inclines and rucking? Little things like that is the way I like to go to it, Brandon, right? That way we're not just adding. Because as you know, once you've used up the time in the day, then you start hitting your stress, then you start affecting your sleep, then you start making eating harder and all of that. So again, practical, real world, I think we covered it.
Absolutely. No, I will admit that I am a data nerd myself. I'm just saying practically, I'm the person that probably spoken about step counts and energy flux the most. And I have very infrequently seen someone that I truly believe has hit a cap. And when it has, it's been confounded. So I'll give you an example. There's research by Willis, I believe, that looks at the influence of energy balance status on energy expenditure from activity. And it's within this constrained energy expenditure model. And they find it was a best fit model, essentially. So this is statistical modeling. But what they did was they looked at interventions where people are in a large deficit versus maintenance versus a surplus, and wanted to see what the best fit, what they mean by that, what model best fits this. Is it the constrained model or the additive model? Well, in my model for energy flux, I'm keeping people at maintenance or in a slight surplus, but I'm allowing activity to increase that maintenance calorie intake and also help with nutrient partitioning and insulin sensitivity and nutrient delivery. Now, what's interesting about that, and now I was utilizing energy flux. I think I had spoken on your podcast about it even before this Willis paper came out because it's fairly new. Now, the interesting thing about that is that when they did a best fit model analysis, they found that the constrained model only was the best fit, meaning it was most applicable when someone was in a deficit in an active period of weight loss. Now, that could be from multiple components, but we also know that metabolic adaptation downregulates a lot of the same components that would also decrease energy expenditure and could be confounded or conflated for the constrained energy expenditure model. It's very hard to disentangle metabolic adaptation, low energy availability, and the constrained energy expenditure model. Because if we think about it, a lot of times NEAT downregulations can be in the realm between 400 to 500 plus calories per day. But then if someone's doing a lot of activity, but then they're sitting a lot, that could be a downregulation in NEAT, but then it's almost conflated because they're doing 24-hour measurements of energy expenditure through doubly labeled water. They can't really disentangle. Was that from NEAT, or were they not burning as many calories as we assume they would based off the cardio or the step count that they were doing? So there's many things that we can disentangle there. But when you look at maintenance or in a surplus, the additive model, meaning the more steps you do, or the more activity, it was specifically activity. So I don't want to mischaracterize the research. It wasn't looking at step counts, but the more activity you did, the more calories you burned. And so there's many influences within that. There's many different variables where for most people, I don't think they have to worry about it. There have been some very specific cases, and I'll give you a case study or an example. I have had many women that were contest prep athletes. They were competitors that have come to me on enormously high step counts, 25 to 30,000 steps per day. They're on very low energy intake. And it's almost like it's something that people within the functional realm refer to as weight loss resistance, which I have a little bit of an issue with just because the fragility narrative that comes with that. And it's a misunderstanding of physiology. It's not that they don't respond to a deficit, it's that their energy expenditure is so low in so many other components that they're not eliciting a rate of loss that would be in alignment with what most people would expect. Now, I have a specific case that it was an IFBB Figure Pro, which was on under 1,200 calories per day, doing 2+ hours of cardio per day. Her step count was approximately like 20,000 steps per day. Most of that was actually being done through cardio, though, because she was doing higher intensity cardio for 120 minutes a day. So it wasn't picking up, it wasn't like she was doing a lot of daily activity. It was more so she was getting like 14,000 steps per day just through cardio, like intentional cardio, and then about 6,000 throughout the course of the day. So she was very sedentary in between these bouts. Early in the morning, fasted cardio an hour, before bed an hour, and then throughout the course of the day, she wasn't too active. However, when I looked through, I put a comprehensive lab analysis. Her thyroid, her sex hormones, everything was downregulated. She had hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is essentially the cessation of menstrual cycle for 3 or more months due to low energy availability. So all these different physiological components were downregulated to the point that her body wasn't burning a lot of energy. So it was just what she had from resting metabolic rate, and she was a very small female, what she had from energy expenditure, but all these different components, including her NEAT, her non-exercise activity thermogenesis, were downregulated. So a lot of times that may be misconstrued for the energy constraint model, and it could definitely be a constraint, but I think that there are many other inputs from a metabolic adaptation perspective, specifically from an adaptive thermogenesis perspective, which is where we see a decrease in metabolic rate specifically, or energy expenditure specifically, that exceeds what we would expect from weight loss alone. And then we also have to tie in low energy availability and relative energy deficiency. So just for anyone out there, I don't think most people have to worry about this. And if you are someone that you're just trying to become a healthier version of yourself and improve your body composition, you're at 10,000 steps per day, don't worry about going to 12,000, and that you're not going to get a benefit from it.
Exactly. And how many of those people in these studies are lifting weights too? I always
100%.
think that, right? The last thing I want to add to this, we'll go to the next question, is I just recently did an episode about the walking snacks research from like 2022 that compared squatting,
You're
walking.
talking about exercise snacks?
Yeah, but specifically they looked at squatting versus walking versus sitting for 7.5 hours, and the vast difference in, muscle protein synthesis and vascular blood flow and insulin sensitivity between those groups, walking being the superior group of them all. So even when you talk about confounding variables and what happens during fat loss, how you start to compensate across the board, it's important to tie those together and not overthink it. That's the goal, not overthink it. So, all right, let's go to question 3, which you're going to answer first here. And that is, what is a realistic rate of muscle gain for someone over 50 who's lost significant weight and is now training hard?
All right. So I think the first thing that we need to consider and understand is that the rate of muscle gain isn't linear, and it depends heavily on your training age. So both based on like the research and then also my experience coaching clients of all different ages and training levels, I found that the best way to go about this in terms of how to conceptualize this is to scale your rate of gain based on your level of advancement. So if you are, now this question didn't really disentangle, it could be assumed that they were training previously or they just started training. So if you are a novice, I would aim for a monthly rate of gain of around 2% of your body weight per week. The less trained you are, the more, essentially, the larger of a ceiling you have and the quicker you could push for gains. If you're an intermediate, I would aim for a rate of gain of 1 to 1.5% per month. And then if you're advanced, it can be as low as 0.5 to 1% per month. So for someone who's over 50, who's lost a lot of weight and is now training hard, the rate of gain that they will have will depend on whether they're more of a novice or they've trained consistently for years. And then I get a lot of clients that I want to cover this because of the context that this listener sent to us about the fact that they just lost weight. And I get a lot of clients who are very fat loss focused initially, and now they want to focus on building muscle. And if this is where you are now, I think it's important to realize that fat loss and muscle gain do not operate on the same time course. So the rate of fat loss far exceeds the rate of muscle gain. So in a deficit, most people can lose and safely lose, say, 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week, especially early on. But in a surplus, I would only really recommend most people, if they're really trying to maximize, we're talking about maximizing muscle gain in terms of lean mass accrual and fat, and making sure that there's not excessive fat mass accumulation. I would recommend most people to target 0.25% per week. And so that's going to even taper down as someone becomes more experienced. So I think one of the biggest mistakes people get when they've been in this cutting mindset is they're used to seeing quick progress, especially things they're seeing like almost daily improvements. And they want to spend equal amount of time cutting and building, and that just cannot be the case. The reality is that muscle takes much longer to build than fat takes to lose. And that means that your yearly strategy needs to reflect that. So with clients myself, I like to do a 4-to-1 ratio in terms of building time and time spent in a surplus or even at maintenance as compared to time spent in a fat loss phase. So if you're 50 or, 50 plus or not, realize that muscle gain is going to be slow, but with the right strategy, it's possible, especially if you're doing the things that support hypertrophy the most. So you want to make sure that you're eating in a modest surplus, you're prioritizing protein intake, you're progressively overloading in your training, and that you're not overlooking the lifestyle variables, especially in your 50s. You want to make sure that you're managing recovery, you're getting in adequate sleep, and you're managing your stress, because these are all things that could have downstream effects on not only hormones, your biofeedback, your recovery, but also your ability to accrete or to gain muscle mass. And another just food for thought, or just like a little suggestion out there, is be patient. A lot of times I've had a lot of clients that come to me. I have a lot of clients that are between, I generally work with people between 35 and 55, but right now I have, at least a handful of individuals that are between 60 and 70. And I find this to be very interesting, but they're very impatient. And sometimes I'm not saying that they're at the end of their life, but they have waited so long to make these changes that they're so excited to do so, but they want to see, fast progress. They want to see it like right out the gate. And what you have to realize is you have to be patient. You can't like mini bulk your way to meaningful gains. And you have to realize that this is a process just like anything else. And give yourself grace and know that this is going to be a process, that it's an investment. I look at it almost like I would an investment fund. Like every day that I train or I have a client train, it's a penny into the progress bank. And over time, you realize, hey, I have a lump sum of money, or I've been able to save something that's really going to be able to set me up from a foundation perspective later on in life, but it doesn't happen overnight. So don't rush the process.
Yeah. Patience seems to be underline everything we talk about, including fat loss. And I'm going to cross that off my list because you mentioned it. But what I like that you did, in addition to talking to the rate, because people do get kind of hung up on how fast should I be able to gain muscle, and therefore it implies maybe there's a lack of patience for that. You talked about the time scale in two respects. One being the ratio, which is a nice way to put it, because then you put in perspective, well, how much should I be cutting on a regular basis? It's not what most people think, where it's this switch that you're always going into dieting mode. And then also the implying how long it should take then to gain the muscle, which is a lot longer than people think, right? It's, at least in my experience working with clients, like a good 6 or 9 months or more sometimes for a thing. And people are like, well, can I just do it for 2 months and then go back? And I think there's disadvantages to that, because you're not going to see the result. You're also going to not give yourself that anabolic advantage, let's call it, of sustaining that surplus for a while. And you see some magic happen when you hit, months 3, 4, 5 with everything, including your metabolism cranking up for a lot of people, which is another point I wanted to mention, in that if you're not tracking this somewhat precisely, per the numbers that Brandon's mentioned, which are not that big, they're like kind of almost in the noise. If you don't have a good way to track it or a good coach to work with, you might fall behind on the intake needs. It happens all the time, right? Where you plateau going up because you're not sort of staying ahead of that with your intake. I'll get clients who say, why am I feeling hungry? I'm like, that's probably your body telling you are under-resourced right now, and that metabolism's cranking up. Maybe, maybe not, right? Could be cravings, could be other things. And so that comes to mind. And then hitting on the actual numbers, how do you even measure all this? This goes back to something we talked about on your podcast with body fat and lean mass. I think it could be very helpful to have your measurements, have your strength numbers, understand there's also a difference between strength and hypertrophy depending on how experienced you are. If you're a novice, you're going to get a lot of that neuromuscular adaptation. Your numbers are going to go shooting up, but you're not going to see anything visible for a while. You're just not, and that's okay. So you're going to have to be patient with it. If you're more advanced, you kind of know what to look for. So I think that that kind of puts it all together. And then be patient, but also be ready to say when you've hit the goal you want to hit, because it's kind of an art, not just a science, right? You might say it's 6 months, and then you get to 6 months and everything's feeling great and the numbers are moving and you really don't notice too much extra body fat. There's nothing preventing you from continuing. You could train and gain for a long time if it's right for you. So
absolutely.
All right. I guess we beat that one to death, right? That's a good one.
Hell yeah.
All right. So question number 4 is about home gym equipment. I love this one. What's the best use of space for a small home gym? Free weights or machine like the Total Gym? Am I taking this one first?
Yes, you are. You're definitely going to be the expert, because I have only trained in a home gym during one period of my life.
You know what? A home gym is what got me where I am right now, because back during the pandemic, everything shut down. I didn't have anything, and I had to hustle on Craigslist and Facebook to get a rack and a bar. And around that time, I was reading the muscle and strength pyramids and starting strength and all of that. So it's all going to depend on what your goal is, how you want to train, how much you're willing to invest and the space and all that. However, I think people make excuses on this a little bit in that if you give me your footprint, if you send me your blueprint of your room, I could probably fit a power rack in there. Like almost always, even a tiny room. I mean, there's exceptions. You also have to consider, the ceiling clearance, right? If you're in a basement, you're not going to be able to necessarily do overhead presses with a 7-foot high basement. So I think the best use of space to me is the one that's going to give you sustainability for growth. We talk about progressive overload. If you invest a ton in equipment that is going to hit a ceiling within 6 months or a year, you might regret that decision. So I would think carefully about what's going to allow you to have longevity. For me, a home gym is one of the biggest hacks for people who are busy. It's not for everybody. Not everybody can afford it or have the space. Some people like to go to commercial gyms for a lot of reasons. The plethora of crazy equipment they have, right? Lots and lots of equipment, the camaraderie, the community, the music, whatever. But think of the pros and cons here of you save on your commute, you have a lot of convenience. You can do some clever things like 2-a-days, very tiny sessions, exercise snacks, all that fun stuff that I'm doing. You could do rehab, you could do therapy. It gives you a lot more options when you're at home. So long story short, what's the best use of space? I would see if you could fit a rack or free weights as the foundation. That is my opinion. But I have clients who have a tonal. I have clients who have Bowflex, and it can work, but it tends to like top out at some point, and it's kind of weird to be able to do all the potential training you want to do. So I'm going to start there, Brandon, and curious on your thoughts.
Perfect. Yeah, I definitely agree with the power rack and then some additional equipment pieces. But I think that it's very important to really get down to the brass tacks and really realize that this is going to depend on your goals, your experience level, your budget, and then how much you prioritize space efficiency versus exercise variety. And I say the latter because I work with a lot of intermediate to advanced trainees that are trying to get to that next level. And so a lot of times we are trying to bias certain regions of a muscle group. And I'm not saying they're beyond compound basic lifts, but we need a little bit more variety. We need a little bit more equipment accessibility. So, you hit on things that I would say for the general person 100%, and I'll take this more maybe from the clientele that I work with and maybe some of the home gyms that I've built out. What I found to work best for clients that train at home, especially when I'm walking them through the process of, hey, we're going to build out a gym. This is a lot of people that come to work with me. They're high achievers, they're high performers. And whether they're a high performer in the gym or not, they want to become one. They want to become that person that has a next level physique. So oftentimes they're more committed and, bought into the process than your average gym goer, to be honest with you. And so often what I do is I recommend a hybrid approach. And what I mean by that is I want to combine free weights and then a multi-hybrid rack or like cable season. And the one I like most and I recommend clients to get a lot is one of the Prime Prodigy racks. They have a full series of them. And so like one of the constructions, and I actually looked into some of my client programs to see like some of the setups that I've given them. One of the ones that has worked really well, that is really good for a small space, like I have some people with a 1-car garage or one room of their basement, is to combine adjustable dumbbells, which you can fit into tight spaces, which is also going to replace multiple pairs, and then a Prime Prodigy rack, which if you guys aren't familiar with that, it has a squat rack in it. It has a dual high and low cable pulley system in a single unit, and also has a pull-up bar. And so if you get a barbell and then you get an adjustable bench, you literally have everything that you need, and you can do almost every both free weight and cable-based exercise you could think of. You could do flies, you could do, lengthen partially, all these different things, cable pull downs, all these different exercises, both for the upper and lower body. And it's not small by any means, but it has a good footprint for as much of it's delivering. So you can have a squat rack, you can do your compound basic, multi-joint movements, but then you can also do other movements that you wouldn't be able to do if you only had free weights, and you also wouldn't have the same resistance profile. So one thing that I really like to do this for is a lot of like cable lateral work. And I'll do it in, really be able to get it into a lengthened position, because if you are only using something like a dumbbell, you're only going to have short overload at the top of the movement. So these are just little more advanced and maybe a little bit more intricate strategies. But I think either way that you would go, if you are someone that's willing to invest into your health, your fitness, your body composition, and build a gym in your home, I commend you. So any way that you could start, I'm all for it. But if you're trying to get into a little bit more of the nuances of things, I think that would be the direction that I would suggest or head you in.
This is why I think you're such a great communicator, right? Because you laid out the actual product, the products and the specific things. It's funny you mentioned the Prime Prodigy, because there's a really cheap rack on Amazon by Fitness Reality. Okay. It's been around for maybe 8 years. I've told tons of people about it just because it's so inexpensive for the budget. It's like $400, and it has an optional lat pull down, full up and down cable attachment, and the bar built in. But there was a funny YouTube video about it, because it was my first rack that I ever had. And it said, watch how this cheap rack handles 700 pounds. And I thought it was going to implode. They basically loaded racks up high with a bar weighted with 700 pounds. And the guy just dumped it onto the spotter arms, and in slow motion, you're like, oh no, this thing's going to collapse. And it just bounced gently up, and they're like, this is a good rack, And I'm like, okay, wow. I feel good recommending that to people.
Hell yeah.
It's good steel, yeah, it's steel, right? It's 2x2, it's not 3x3, but it's steel. So I love that idea. And the adjustable dumbbells too. I know there's the power blocks, and Bowflex might still make theirs. Occasionally Walmart might even have something that comes through. It doesn't matter. I mean, so what I wanted to add to that was microplates, right? Having microplates for both the barbell and the dumbbells is helpful, because people will say, how do I go up by 5 pounds on my dumbbell from 15 to 20? I can't do it. Microplates are really helpful. And then when you are trying to be efficient with space, you alluded to multi-use. A leg developer at the end of an adjustable bench, there you can find that is really helpful for like leg curls and extensions. It's all plate loaded. Like all my stuff is plate loaded, just because that is how they sell it. And then like a pec deck reverse fly. So anything that could do two or three things is a great idea. So awesome. I love it. Good stuff, man.
Perfect.
Want to go to the next one?
Absolutely.
Hey, just wanted to give a shout out to Philip and the services he offers over at Wits and Weights. I personally worked with Philip for about 8 months, and we did 2-3-month cuts during that time. And I lost a total of 33 pounds of scale weight and about 5 inches off my waist working with Philip. A few things I really enjoyed about working with Philip is, number one, he's really taken the time to develop a deep expertise in nutrition and also resistance training. So he has that depth. If you want to go deep on the whys with Philip, he has the chops to do that. But if you want to just kind of get some instruction and more practical advice and a plan on what you need to do, Philip's a great communicator. He can pull back and communicate at that level also. The other thing about Philip is that he is a lifter himself, so he's very familiar with the performance and body composition goals that most lifters have when they're looking for nutrition advice. And also Philip has engineer's brain and is trained in engineering. So what that means or what that has resulted in is that he has really some very efficient systems set up and uses technology very efficiently to make the coaching experience very easy and very efficient, and works pretty much like clockwork. And you can really track your results, and you will have real data when you're done working with Philip, and also have access to some tools likely that you can continue to use to really keep a handle on your nutrition. So if all that sounds interesting to you, Philip, like all good coaches, has a ton of free information out there, and really encourage you to go check out his podcast or his Facebook page and see if he may be able to help you out. So thanks again, Philip.
Okay, this is the last question. So diet fatigue. You get to answer this one first. What nutritional training or lifestyle changes do you make when someone's dealing with diet fatigue?
All right. So I have taken a lot of clients through fat loss phases. So I've experienced and encountered a lot of diet fatigue. And really, if you are someone that is unfamiliar with the concept, it's just the fatigue, both mental and physical, that can accumulate across the course of a fat loss phase. And really, when I encounter this, or I see a client that is dealing with this, it's starting to come across in their check-ins and their biofeedback, even in their photos sometimes. I'm a big fan of pulling back to be able to push forward. And that's actually an expression that I use with my clients. I have a push and pull method. So there are times that I'm pushing them towards fat loss, where we're driving greater body composition change. And then there's times that I'm pulling back and dissipating fatigue. And I say this very specifically because the clients that I work with are high performers, and they're also those type of individuals that they would bury themselves if I wasn't there. And so it's not always about pushing harder. I like to take what I call a systems-based approach that supports both someone's physiology and their psychology. And that's going to utilize all three of these interventions. So this was a great question that they're looking at nutrition, training, and lifestyle. So on the nutrition side, I will usually start with refeeds and high days. But if a client is deep into a dieting phase and their biofeedback is showing signs such as heightened hunger, low mood, elevated stress, even some water retention, like you're getting some edema from just very high stress levels and potentially from cortisol. I'll often implement what I refer to as a deficit deload. And that's essentially a 4 to 7 day diet break where I raise calories back to maintenance or even slightly above. And I would rather overshoot it than undershoot it. I'm really trying to use this as a restorative break to lower their perceived exertion, both physically and mentally, their perception of restriction. So I'm trying to get them more into a flexible eating control or flexible eating attitudes rather than rigid restriction. I'm trying to reduce stress and I want to reset them before the next fat loss phase block. And so during a deficit deload, like I said, I'm going to bring calories back to maintenance or above. And we're really focusing on high satiety whole food meals to support appetite and micronutrient needs. Because if your biggest piece of feedback that is indicating diet fatigue, besides the mental stress of it all, is that you have very heightened hunger, a lot of times people kind of, I don't want to say blow it, but they almost don't take advantage of the deficit deload, or some people would term that a diet break. They start eating hyperpalatable foods. They start having fun foods and things that are going to drive generally passive overconsumption. So sometimes they'll overshoot their calories, but they actually didn't get a satiety benefit. And one of the biggest mistakes I see with clientele, or that I've seen just in other applications, is where someone takes the same amount of calories that they have and they increase them. So say they were dieting on 2,000 calories and they were in a 500 calorie deficit. So we brought them to 2,500 calories. But they brought that 2,000 calorie diet that was mostly made of whole, satiating, micronutrient dense foods. They bring it up to 2,500 calories, but they eliminate a lot of the satiating food sources that they had that were helping with satiety, appetite regulation. They swap it with fun food, which is great from a pleasure perspective, but now you're not actually getting the appetite regulating, you're not getting the micronutrients that are going to help with, hormonal status and mood and neurotransmitter secretion. And so that is something that I really try to be very consistent and very deliberate with the food sources I use. And I found that by inserting a deficit deload before clients hit a wall, they're able to come back, refresh, refocus, and ready to make better body composition progress going forward without burning out. Then from a training perspective, I'll usually pull, auto regulation strategies, because a lot of times people who love lifting, they forget that in a deficit, lifting and training is another stress. It's another stimulus, but it's not another stress. So if I see biofeedback is starting to suffer, this could be things like poor sleep, nagging soreness, or like joint aches and pains, what I would refer to as the niggles. I'll auto-regulate intensity by raising RRR. So I'm going to take them, say if they're training 0 reps in reserve, we might go between 2 and 4. I'm going to reduce their total training volume and I'm going to program a deload week. Now, the goal of the deload is not to push performance, it's to dissipate the accumulated fatigue, both physically and mentally. Another component of deloading that I really like to do is to make their sessions more time efficient, because I want to give that client more time back in their day. And then I specifically direct them. It's going to depend on the client and how well I know them or what things work best for them. But I encourage them to use recovery promoting strategies. So that could be extra sleep, that could be a nap. For some, that's yoga. A lot of times it's meditation, or with a lot of people, it's just like take time off your feet, watch a movie, just relax. Like you don't always have to feel like you have to be hyper productive. And really what I'm trying to do is shift them from that sympathetic state into a parasympathetic state. Then from a lifestyle perspective, I like to realize that this is a total accumulation. We have to look at stress. It's your total allostatic load, which means your stress accumulates into one stress bucket. We cannot separate these. You don't have training stress in one bucket, lifestyle stress in another, and nutrition stress in the other. It is all going into one bucket that oftentimes is overflowing. So oftentimes I'm going to lean into recovery-based strategies. So one of the ones that I use most frequently is meditation. So I had mentioned previously that I recommend an app called the Insight Timer. And I like to help clients utilize that, especially at night, but also midday if they find a stressful part of their day. We kind of schedule this based off what is the highest stress portions of your day? When are you feeling anxiety, stress, rumination, things like that? But meditation has so many benefits from a mindfulness perspective, from a psychological perspective, just stress reduction, anxiety reduction. And so that's something that I personally have been practicing meditation for 15 years and I've gotten away from it. And this past year, I've dedicated at least 30 minutes a day towards meditation. And it's just had such a profound impact on my life and quality of life specifically, that I find that integrating with clients, I get speak from experience. And then also it's been very helpful. Other things I really like to do is having them go for walks in nature. And the reason for that, I like to combine two things. Walking is just a great activity in general, especially for your health. But specifically, when you do it around greenery, it helps to lower cortisol and improve mood. And there's a lot of research that backs that. Another thing I really do with a lot of women that I work with specifically is self-care days. I find that I work with a lot of busy mothers that they're always doing for others. So all day they're working like a high level corporate job and they're attending to their boss's needs or their clients' needs or whatever it may be. Then they go home, they're attending to the kids and then the big kid, which is their husband. And so all day, everything is about other people. And they really take on that maternal role, which I love. But at the same time, there isn't enough time where they're just introspectively, kind of looking into themselves and saying, what do I need? So a lot of times what I'll assign is like a spa day or a day to get their nails done or a massage or even just a weekly, weekend family outing. And I do it specifically as part of their programming. So I actually build this into their program. And I do that because when clients feel permission to recover and to pull back, they see recovery as part of their plan. And it shifts their mindset from I'm failing or I shouldn't be doing this or I need to be more productive to I'm succeeding and going to do better by taking care of myself. And Brandon told me to do so. So it's almost like, I don't want to say I'm giving them permission because that's not what it is, but I'm kind of just encouraging them and I'm specifically putting in the plan. And a lot of the people I work with are just executors. And so by me incorporating this into actually something that's scheduled, I build out, different programs for individuals, but when they receive their nutrition program, it's not just a nutrition plan. It's not just a meal plan. It is a nutrition and lifestyle plan. So there are modifications on a weekly basis going to any categories that fall within that. And that's been very helpful for the clients that I work with. So that's what I would suggest.
It's a lot, man. I mean that in a good way. There's a lot of hacks in there and a lot of principles. I'm not going to repeat everything you had. I want to touch on a couple of them and then add things you didn't already cover, which is a challenge, Brandon, because you covered so many good things. The deficit deload, you mentioned overshooting. My listeners need to hear this because you hear me talk all the time about like when I want you to go to maintenance to kind of really push it and make sure you're truly at maintenance. Otherwise you don't get that full benefit. And I think that's really fun. And then you tied to what we talked about in the bulking question about not biasing your food toward the fun food, because then it kind of throws the other phases off. I think that's just if you think of your whole periodization strategy, gaining, losing, sustaining as having these principles, you're going to be good, right? Because that's thinking over the long game, the macro, rather than just, this is an extreme thing I'm doing right now. The satiety, by the way, guys, check out the other podcast, Chasing Clarity, because we talked a lot about that. If you want details on that. And then you said allostatic load. Sometimes I call that the metabolic stack. It's like, here are the 20 things that are adding up in your life that could affect your stress and your metabolism and everything else. Where's the low-hanging fruit? So you mentioned relaxation days as well as building them in. I'm going to add to that and say, yes, you have permission to do whatever the heck makes you relax. If I want to play video games and shoot people in my video games and that relaxes me, I'm going to do that and you're not going to judge me. And then also take like a 4-day vacation. I mean, this is the thing I've been recommending more to people is we get in a mindset of, we're disciplined. We've got our routine. We've got our training program. Yes, we might have deloads. Is it okay to maybe take almost a week off? Maybe. I mean, some people might need that, right, Brandon? I mean, some people need that. I know one of my clients, she works in the news industry, man. Talk about stress these days with everything happening in the news.
Dear Lord.
So she just needs to take some time off and just literally do nothing for a few days. So I'm going to add to some of what you said. First, you mentioned a few of the signs of diet fatigue. I think it's important that we are tracking what's important to us so that we can recognize those signs, not just subjectively, but somewhat objectively, like on a rating scale or something like that. What you mentioned, the hunger, the irritability, even the decline or plateauing in your strength, right? Because strength and muscle kind of are at different timelines, if you will. We talked about that earlier. If you're food obsessed, if you are, having trouble sleeping, like a lot of those things are good signs. And then you mentioned nonlinear dieting quite a bit. I'll say one of my favorite strategies is just the weekend refeed, right? Because almost everybody has the weekend is special versus the week generally. But if your week looks different because you have shift work or your weekend is Tuesday and Wednesday, think about a weekly lifestyle that you have and align your food with that. It'll be a lot easier, as well as the macro timeline of travel, right? Maybe you shouldn't be dieting when you travel. That's a great time to take your break and a great time to take your deload or break from training. As far as training goes, some things I found work really well. When you go to a fat loss phase, prepare for that phase with how you're going to train. Are you going to continue how you're training now? Does it make sense? Or are we going to go to a new program? And this is a great time to evaluate the days per week. If you were doing 4 or 5, maybe you're better off with 3 because you get more sleep days. Maybe, as it happened to me at one time during fat loss, I was better off with 6 very short sessions because it was recoverable. So think about recovery versus stress. The second thing about training I like is auto-regulated programs as opposed to pushing your numbers programs, right? I got a lot of guys in our community who love to push their lifts. They like PRs. You're not going to be chasing those during fat loss, most likely. And so what's what's the alternative? Well, rep range style programs, hypertrophy and bodybuilding style, conjugate. Like there's a lot of options that allow you to, on the given day, train, at or near failure, whatever makes sense, without necessarily pushing your numbers. And then fatigue can really build up during fat loss if you're not careful. So tracking those sore spots, those hot spots, maybe joint connective tissue, low back fatigue, those kinds of things, measuring your soreness and energy as you go along and kind of seeing like, is that tied to your overall allostatic load? And your recovery stack can be very helpful. So I think that's all I wanted to say.
Awesome. I do want to hit on something. You did mention the potential performance decrements that could be experienced in a fat loss phase. I do think that it's important that you go in with a mindset of progression. What I mean by that is you should be going to try to lift more, whether that be from a rep or load perspective, especially in that initial phase or that initial, say first few weeks of a fat loss phase. A lot of people, they go in one of two directions. The one direction is it's almost a scarcity and fragility type of perspective where all of a sudden I've been in a deficit. I've had clients that have emailed me 2 days into a 300 calorie deficit, which is a very modest deficit. And they might've been in a 10% calorie deficit. And they've already told me, I think, performance has dropped. And it's just been a psychological thing. Our psychology has a massive impact on our physiology. And it's very important to realize that. But at the same time, I have the opposite end of the spectrum, very advanced trainees, that they want to continue making gains as they had been in the building phase. And I've pushed their calories up quite high. Their training volume is in a good place in terms of their recovery ability, their volume capacity, their work capacity. And then all of a sudden they start seeing a loss of a rep here or there, or they can't lift the same loads. And it's very important to realize that that is a natural and normal part of fat loss. We have to think about it from even just a biomechanics or a leveraging perspective. So say, for instance, the biggest example that I see, and I just had this conversation with a client named Mark just a few days ago. He is a very advanced trainee. He's been a natural pro bodybuilder, and he no longer competes, but he's still, his physique is at such a greater level now than it was even when he competed. So he is an outlier to say the least. But this past offseason, we did an 8-month building phase leading into the current fat loss phase we're in. He hit his all-time greatest strength numbers, greatest performance. From a load and a rep volume perspective, he was off the charts. And I've been training him for 2.5 years, so I'm able to compare really things over time. And we were able to get to body weight high that was the same as we did the last building phase, which was over a year ago, but his performance blew it out of the water. So it was just very good nutritional periodization plus training, programming, matching everything together. But this just recently reached out to me that his performance is dropping. Now we're 10 weeks into a fat loss phase. This dude is around 7% body fat. And so he's very, very lean. And what I had to explain to him is, Mark, you're not only down 16 pounds as compared to where you were in the building phase, but you have lost some of your leverage. So specifically what he was noticing is on his barbell incline press, he was unable to lift the same loads, or he was missing like a rep or two, which still, when I broke it down from a body weight perspective in terms of body weight towards body, the actual lifting, the actual weight he was lifting, he was stronger pound for pound. However, I had to explain to him the fact that when you lose fat, you don't indiscriminately lose fat. You lose fat from your entire body. So in terms of a pressing movement, especially, you have to realize you've lost fat off your back and then also off your chest. So technically, if you were doing the same amount of weight, you would actually be lifting more because of the fact that now it's a longer range of motion that you have to go through to get the same, if you were going quote unquote full range of motion in terms of your technique and execution, your range of motion has now been extended. So say you lost an inch off your back, an inch off your chest, just from a body fat perspective, you now have 2 more inches to cover with that same load. So it's not reasonable to think that you won't be able to maintain that. So you have to realize that there's many inputs that are causing potential decrements in your actual training performance. The one is that you're losing body fat. So you're a smaller individual, you might have less, your mechanics might change. It might be harder to brace certain lifts. Most times people will notice that things like their presses, some of their pulls, they'll be most impacted. Then secondarily, you have to realize that the acute energy deficit that you're in is impacting the substrates that you have available to fuel actual training performance. Now that could inhibit some motor unit recruitment or even just a recovery capacity. So now you have, depleted glycogen stores. You have less actual fullness in your muscles. So that's also going to interrupt your ability to contract muscle or even go through the range of motion in the same capacity, have the same force or, muscle output that you would have if you were in, a full-on surplus or building phase. So there's many things I think that we have to be a little bit more aware of these things and realize, all right, I want to go in with the mindset I'm going to keep progressing, especially in that beginning. But if I start to see things falling by the wayside, I'm not saying falling in terms of like a rep or two here or there, and you're deep into a fallacy, realize that's par for the course. We can make adjustments to try to alleviate that, whether it be a volume reduction or intensity reduction, or really focusing on a different rep range. I often find that it's advantageous to shift rep ranges during a phallus phase with some of my clientele. I actually will shift them down in rep ranges rather than most people will shift things up. I actually want them to maintain that top end strength as much as possible. Yep. So I'm trying to have them feel those same loads from a neuromuscular perspective. So say, for instance, they were lifting a specific weight for 6 to 8 reps. I might downshift that to 5 to 7 reps during a phallus phase, or 4 to 6 reps. I'm still going to stay within that hypertrophy zone, but I want them to feel those lifts so it's still familiar. They still have confidence. They just may be doing, say it was 300 pounds on bench, they may be doing that for 3 sets of 4 to 5 rather than 3 sets of 6 to 7. And so these are just different adjustments we can make, but there's also a mindset and a mental perspective you need to bring into your phallus phases from a training perspective. That's very important.
I agree. Act as if you're building strength and muscle. Don't let it hold you back. Don't assume failure. The relative strength also often increases. And so that's kind of a fun metric.
I think it's like a Wilks score, they call it.
The Wilks score. Yeah, right. And you mentioned lower rep range. I really do love that, because that's another misconception, right? Is that you need more volume or more reps, or you're trying to burn fat. I do love top set, back off set for people in fat loss, and only doing 2 sets for some people, because it's a good way to save time sometimes and keep that top end intensity on that first set, then get the volume in on the second. That's just a little aside of something I'm in love with these days. I think we covered it all, didn't we?
I think so, my friend.
All right. So some of the, these were some fantastic questions, and they're only some of the ones we're answering for you guys. So I want you to go catch the rest of them that we covered: appetite, hunger, whole bunch of topics on chasing clarity. And we covered 4 questions on there. So go follow Chasing Clarity in your podcast app. Check out Brandon and I over there. It's in your feed right now. Use the link in the show notes. We can see you over there. Brandon, thanks, brother, for doing this, for setting it up. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Philip. I want to say thank you not only for joining me, but also for having me on. And I really hope that everyone out in both our audiences really values the evidence-based information that we brought. And I was really glad that we were able to connect, because as I've told you off air, I'm very into connecting with like-minded individuals. We both have a very similar intention and goal, which is just to spread better information and really have a positive impact on this industry. So I'm glad that we could unite and really benefit both our audiences in the process.
Yeah, and I always benefit personally too, man, from talking to you too, and learning and growing along with the audience. So again, thanks again.
Absolutely.